3 True Scary Park Ranger Stories. Story 1. The Cry in the Canyon. Park Ranger Alex had always prided himself on his ability to keep calm in any situation. After 10 years working in one of the most remote desert national parks in Arizona, he had encountered his fair share of oddities, hikers, who had gone missing for days only to reappear within. Oh, memory of their time in the wilderness, strange lights that flickered over the horizon at night, and ancient ruins that seemed to be untouched by time. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what happened that night when he heard the crying in the canyon. It was late autumn, and most of the tourists had long since packed up and left. The sweltering summer heat had given way to cool nights, and crisp, clear days. The park's vast stretches of jagged rock formations, deep canyons, and desert flora looked serene under the moonlight. The tourist season had ended, and with it came a sense of isolation that Alex had grown used to over the years. On this particular evening, Alex was patrolling a remote section of the park known for its deep, winding canyons and treacherous trails. This area, far from the main campgrounds, rarely saw visitors except for the occasional adventurer looking for solitude. The air was dry, and the full moon bathed the landscape in an otherworldly glow, casting long shadows over the canyon walls. Everything seemed peaceful, but that peace was soon shattered by the sound of crying. At first, Alex thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He stopped in his tracks, listening carefully. The wind whispered through the desert plants, rustling the brittle branches of cacti, but beneath that, there was a distinct sound, a soft, distant crying that echoed off the canyon walls. It was faint, almost blending in with the night air, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was weeping deep within the canyon. Alex's first instinct was that a hiker must be in trouble. Perhaps someone had gotten lost or injured while exploring the more dangerous parts of the canyon. It wasn't uncommon for inexperienced hikers to underestimate the desert's dangers, especially at night when the temperature plummeted. He reached for his radio and called in the strange sound, but there was no response, typical for the deep canyons where radio signals were unreliable at best. He knew he couldn't wait for backup. If someone was hurt or lost, time could be crucial. With a growing sense of urgency, Alex began to make his way toward the source of the sound. The crying grew louder as he descended deeper into the canyon, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trail was narrow, bordered by sheer cliffs on one side and a steep drop on the other. He moved cautiously, knowing that one misstep could send him tumbling into the abyss below. The sound of weeping continued, echoing eerily off the canyon walls. It seemed to be coming from just around the next bend, but every time Alex rounded a corner, the source of the crying remained just out of sight. He shouted, "Hello. Are you all right? Do you need help?" But there was no response, only the continuous, haunting sobbing. As Alex pressed on, the air grew colder. The drop in temperature was sudden and jarring. Just moments before, the desert night had been cool but comfortable, yet now the cold was bone-chilling, and Alex could see his breath in front of him. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, and continued down the trail, his flashlight illuminating the jagged rocks and sparse vegetation around him. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides, and the canyon walls towered overhead, casting long, menacing shadows. The crying, once distant, now seemed impossibly close. It was the sound of a woman, a soft, mournful wail that sent shivers down Alex's spine. But something about it was off. It didn't sound entirely human. Finally, Alex reached a clearing at the base of the canyon. The trail ended here, and beyond was a sheer cliff that dropped into a narrow ravine below. The crying was louder than ever, but there was no one in sight. Alex scanned the area with his flashlight, the beam of light bouncing off the rocky terrain, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no gear, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there. He was about to call out again when the crying suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. It was as if the entire canyon had gone still, waiting. The hairs on the back of Alex's neck stood up, and a deep, primal sense of fear gripped him. He had been in dangerous situations before, encounters with wild animals, near falls from steep cliffs, but this was different. This was something he couldn't explain. Then, out of the silence, came a voice. A whisper, soft and almost indistinguishable, but close. Too close. "Help me," it said, barely more than a breath. It was the voice of a young woman, but it didn't sound right. There was something wrong about it. The way it echoed in the canyon, the way it seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere at once, made Alex's skin crawl. He shone his flashlight toward the source of the voice, but saw nothing. Just the empty canyon, bathed in the pale light of the moon. "Where are you?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to stay calm. For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, a figure began to materialize at the edge of the ravine. It was a woman, or at least it looked like a woman. She was standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of Alex's flashlight. Her hair was long and matted, hanging over her face like a veil, and her clothes were tattered and soaked with water, despite the fact that there hadn't been rain in the area for weeks. Alex's heart raced as he watched the figure. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" he asked, though he already knew something wasn't right. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her head, and for the first time, Alex saw her face, or what was left of it. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin that stretched far too wide for any human face. Alex stumbled backward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The woman's grin grew wider, and she took a step toward him. "Help me," she whispered. Again, her voice now distorted, like a recording being played backward. Panic surged through Alex as he turned and ran. He didn't care about the steep trail, or the rocks beneath his feet. All that mattered was getting away from whatever that thing was. He could hear the soft, whispering voice behind him, calling out to him as he ran, but he didn't dare look back. It felt like an eternity before he finally reached the top of the canyon, and saw the faint lights of the ranger station in the distance. His legs burned, and his lungs ached, but he kept running until he burst through the door of the station, slamming it shut behind him. His fellow rangers were startled by his sudden entrance, but Alex couldn't bring himself to explain what had happened. How could he describe the thing he had seen in the canyon? They wouldn't believe him. Hell, he barely believed it himself. The next morning, Alex and 2 other rangers returned to the canyon to search for any sign of the woman. They combed the area where Alex had seen her, but there was nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no sign anyone had been there at all. But Alex knew what he had seen, and he knew that he would never forget the sound of that voice, the voice that still haunted his dreams, calling out to him from the depths of the canyon. From that day on, Alex refused to patrol that part of the park alone. He never spoke of what he had seen again, but every now and then, when the wind was just right, he swore he could hear it, the faint sound of crying, carried on the breeze. Story 2, The Watcher in the Woods. Ranger Sarah had been stationed at a national forest in the Pacific Northwest for 3 years. Nestled between towering trees and dense undergrowth, her post was as isolated as they come. The forest stretched on for miles, a thick sea of green broken only by the occasional trail, eat or fire lookout. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of a wild animal. For Sarah, it was a perfect escape from the hectic pace of city life. However, as tranquil as the forest could be, it also had an unnerving side. The dense canopy of trees blocked out most of the sunlight, casting long shadows that lingered even in the middle of the day. At night, the forest transformed into something else entirely. The once peaceful trails took on an eerie silence, and even the most experienced hikers knew to stay on the main paths after dark. Sarah's unease with the forest had begun about a month ago, when reports started coming in of strange sightings near one of the less frequented trails. Hikers claimed to have seen a figure, a man, or at least something that resembled a man, watching them from the shadows. No one had gotten a clear look, but the descriptions were all eerily similar: tall, dressed in dark clothing, and always lurking just out of sight. The sightings were always fleeting. Just a glimpse before the figure disappeared into the trees. At first, Sarah chalked it up to overactive imaginations. After all, it was easy to let your mind play tricks on you, in a place as remote and isolated as the forest. But as the reports kept coming in, she couldn't ignore them anymore. She and a few other rangers decided to do a thorough sweep of the area, but despite their efforts, they found nothing, no signs of a person, no footprints, not even disturbed underbrush. Then, one evening, Sarah encountered the figure herself. It was late September, and the forest was transitioning into fall. The air had taken on a crisp edge, and the leaves were beginning to turn shades of gold and red. Sarah was patrolling one of the more remote trails, one that wound through a particularly dense section of the forest, when she saw him. At first, it was just a shadow, barely noticeable among the trees. But as she got closer, Sarah realized it wasn't just a trick of the light. There was someone standing off the trail, partially obscured by the thick undergrowth. He was tall, much taller than Sarah expected, and dressed in a long, dark coat that seemed out of place for the mild weather. His face was hidden in shadow, but she could feel his gaze on her, cold and unblinking. Sarah's heart raced as she stared at the figure, her hand instinctively reaching for the radio clipped to her belt. "Hello," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Are you lost? Do you need help?" There was no response. The figure remained still, watching her. For a moment, Sarah considered approaching him. Maybe he was just a lost hiker, confused and in need of assistance. But something about the way he stood there, perfectly still, sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't natural. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and disappeared into the trees, melting into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing. Should she follow him? Call for backup? But when she finally gathered the courage to step off the trail, and into the underbrush where the figure had stood, there was no sign of him. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Even as she sat in the safety of the ranger station, the memory of the figure's gaze lingered. She kept the radio close at hand, half expecting to hear reports of another sighting, but the night passed without incident. Over the next few days, Sarah patrol led the same trail again and again, hoping to catch another glimpse of the figure. But each time, the forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The sightings from hikers stopped as well, and for a while, it seemed like the mysterious watcher had disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. But then, one evening, Sarah found something that made her blood run cold. She had been checking a section of the forest where the trees grew so thick that the sunlight barely penetrated, even during the day. It was a secluded spot, far off the beaten path, and not somewhere hikers typically ventured. As she made her way through the dense undergrowth, her foot caught on something, a piece of cloth, partially buried in the dirt. Kneeling down, Sarah uncovered the cloth. It was a tattered, dark coat, much like the one the figure had been wearing. The fabric was worn and torn, as if it had been out in the elements for a long time. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Inside the coat, nestled in the dirt, was a collection of old, yellowed photographs. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the photos. They were black and white, the edges frayed and faded with age. The people in the photos were all different, but they shared one unsettling commonality. Each person was standing in the forest, looking directly at the camera. And behind them, barely visible in the background, was the same figure Sarah had seen, the watcher in the woods. Her heart pounded as she flipped through the photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. Some of the photos were decades old, the people in them long since gone. But the figure, the watcher, remained the same. Always in the back row. And always watching. Sarah's breath hitched as she came to the last photograph. It was a recent one, newer than the others, and the person in it sent a wave of terror crashing over her. It was her. The photo showed Sarah standing on the trail, exactly where she had been the day she saw the figure. And just like in the other photos, the watcher was there, lurking in the shadows behind her. Panic surged through Sarah as she stuffed the photos back into the coat and bolted from the spot. She didn't stop running until she reached the ranger station, her mind racing with questions. How had the photo been taken? Who had taken it? And how long had she been watched without even realizing it? That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She kept the lights on, her eyes darting to the windows, half expecting to see the figure standing outside, watching her. But the night passed without incident. In the following weeks, Sarah couldn't bring herself to return to that part of the forest. She never spoke of what she had found, not even to the other rangers. But every now and then, when she patrolled the trails, she could feel it, that cold, unblinking gaze following her. And she knew, deep down, that the watcher was still out there, hidden among the trees, waiting. Story 3, The Vanishing Campers. The rumors had been circulating for years. Hikers would go into the forest and never return. It was always the same remote section of the park, a place so isolated that even seasoned rangers, like Mark, avoided it when they could. The locals called it the Lost Valley, a name th. had become synonymous with fear and mystery. Some said the area was cursed, others claimed that wild animals, more dangerous than any known species, roamed the valley. But no one had ever come back with proof, at least, not alive. Mark had heard the stories, but as a ranger, he learned to take such tales with a grain of salt. Every forest had its ghost stories, its legends passed down from one generation of hikers to the next. Still, there was something about the Lost Valley that made him uneasy. He had patrolled that section of the park only a handful of times in his career, and each time, he had the distinct feeling that he was being watched. The air always felt colder there, the silence heavier. Then, one autumn, 2 experienced campers went missing in the Lost Valley, and everything changed. The campers, Lisa and Greg, set out on a week-long trip into the valley. They were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts, well equipped with gear and experienced in survival techniques. They had left a detailed itinerary with the ranger station, and Mark had been the one to approve their permit. He had warned them about the valley's reputation, but they had laughed it off, eager for adventure. When Lisa and Greg didn't return on their scheduled date, Mark wasn't immediately concerned. Delays happened all the time in the wilderness. People lost track of time, or took longer routes back unexpected. But when 2 days passed with no word, and their emergency beacon remained silent, Mark knew something was wrong. He and a team of rangers set out to search for them. The valley was vast, with twisting trails and steep cliffs that made navigation difficult. The trees were so thick in some areas that they blocked out the sun, casting everything in perpetual twilight. As they ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, animals rustling in the underbrush, were absent. It was as if the entire valley was holding its breath. Mark and the team searched for days, but there was no sign of Lisa and Greg. No footprints, no discarded gear, nothing. It was as if they had simply vanished. Then, on the 4th day, they found the campsite. It was deep in the valley, in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The tent was still standing, though it looked as though it hadn't been touched in days. The fire pit was cold, with no signs of recent activity. Their packs were still there, neatly packed as if they had planned to continue their journey. But Lisa and Greg were nowhere to be found. Mark's stomach churned as he examined the campsite. It didn't make sense. If they had left in a hurry, there would have been signs, footprints, broken branches, something. But everything was eerily intact, as if the campers had simply disappeared without a trace. As they searched the surrounding area, one of the rangers found something even more disturbing, a trail of small bones scattered in the underbrush. At first, they assumed it was from a small animal, perhaps a rabbit or squirrel. But as Mark examined them, his blood ran cold. These weren't animal bones. They were human finger bones, carefully arranged in a line leading deeper into the forest. The discovery sent a wave of unease through the team. They followed the bone trail for another mile, their nerves on edge. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, made them jump. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing closer together as if trying to trap them. Then they found the cabin. It was an old, dilapidated structure, hidden among the trees. The wood was weathered and rotting, the windows dark and broken. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet something about it felt wrong. Too wrong. Mark's instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave the valley and never return. But he couldn't. Not with Lisa and Greg still missing. He and the other rangers approached the cabin, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. Inside, the cabin was worse than they had imagined. The floor was littered with bones, some human, some animal. Old, yellowed newspapers were strewn across the room, filled with stories of missing hikers dating back decades. But the most horrifying discovery was in the back room, a small, windowless space filled with makeshift beds, and shackles bolted to the walls. The stench of decay was overwhelming. It was clear now what had happened to Lisa and Greg, and to the countless others who had ventured into the low street valley. They had been taken, dragged to this cabin and held captive by something, or someone, that thrived in the isolation of the valley. Mark and the Rangers didn't linger. They radioed for backup and left the valley as fast as they could, the weight of their discovery heavy on their minds. The Lost Valley was sealed off after that, the trails closed to the public. But the memory of what they found there never left Mark. He knew that the forest held many secrets, and some of them were better left undiscovered.